If you've been following the news at all, you'll probably know by now that yesterday, Tuesday 10th of October, a fire broke out at the Terminal Car Park 2 at Luton Airport. Looks like it's been pretty bad. Over 1,000 cars have been damaged, and there's even speculation now that the car park might need to be demolished because of the structural damage. And you're probably wondering, what has this got to do with this channel? But the reason I'm talking to you today about the fire at Luton Airport is because of the sheer amount of misinformation that started spreading almost immediately when news of the fire broke. If you follow me on Twitter, or X as we call it now, you might have seen some of my posts about this. But if you haven't, well, you're in for quite the ride. Almost immediately, as news broke of the fire yesterday evening, people started to speculate about the cause. And of course, almost immediately, people were saying, oh, it must have been an electric car that caused the fire. Petrol or diesel cars don't cause fires like that, and when they do, they're easy to put out. And this is what people say over and over again. Petrol and diesel cars, if they catch fire, are easy to put out. And what I think people miss there is that if a multi-storey car park with hundreds of, if not thousands of cars parked in close proximity to each other, if one of those cars catches fire and it's left for even a fairly small amount of time, that fire will spread. And the power source of the car at that point is fairly trivial. Let's be honest, a petrol car or a diesel car has quite a big fuel source in the form of the fuel in the tank that can make a fire worse. That doesn't necessarily mean that that fuel is the source of that fire. It's very, very common for cars to have faults in other areas other than the fuel system, which lead to fire. If you remember all the Vauxhall Zefiras that were catching fire, that was an electrical fault that was causing a fire with those, and then the end result is that car would be completely totaled by fire. It's not actually that common that the fuel itself, unless maybe you have fuel spraying onto a hot exhaust manifold or something like that, it's not actually that common that the fuel is the reason the fire starts. And so some of the comments that get made about vehicle fires in an attempt to discredit EVs are really quite ridiculous. Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue, the local fire service that responded to the fire, who have now managed to extinguish the fire, have said that a diesel-powered vehicle was the source of the fire. The fire started in a diesel-powered car. Now, there are some videos floating around on Twitter that are unverified at this stage, but I noticed that lots of news outlets are running with them as if they are definitely Luton Airport, show what looks an awful lot like a Range Rover Evoque that appears to be on fire. Now, that ties in pretty well with the statement from Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue that it was a diesel-powered vehicle that started the fire. But even then, what I'm seeing is even more people saying, well, oh no, it can't be a diesel car. It must be an EV. It has to be an EV. It's like they're desperate for it to be an electric vehicle that caused the fire. And I've never seen anything quite like it. I've never seen anything quite like this coordinated misinformation campaign almost to make it so that an EV has caused this fire, even though the fire service that actually responded to it and put the fire out are saying that it was a diesel car that started the fire. But almost immediately last night, posts were surfacing saying it was an EV. One person even tweeted saying, I'm on the ground at Luton Airport and I've confirmed with staff there that it was a charging EV that caused the fire. Now, that's quite interesting because you think that there is a heightened increase of risk for a car that's charging because the charging circuit could develop a fault. You know, we go back to talking about it's not necessarily the fuel source that causes the fire. So the charging circuit overheats and that causes a fire, which then spreads. Much more likely than a faulty battery just bursting into flames, because let's be honest, that doesn't happen as often as people are claiming that it does. It's much more likely that it would be a secondary effect of another fire that would cause the battery to then be melted and then catch fire. Yeah, okay, it could be damaged, but for a car that's just parked up, it's pretty unlikely. So charging might introduce an additional element of risk. But there's one slight problem with that theory, and that is that the chargers at Luton Airport are in Terminal Car Park 1, which is a different car park to Terminal Car Park 2. So any of these claims that say it was an EV that was charging that started the fire cannot possibly be true, because it is not possible to charge a car if there are no chargers. And yet you're still seeing people on Twitter saying, oh, it must have been an EV that was charging. It can't have been. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that if there's not a charger in the car park, it can't have been a car that was charging that caught fire. I don't need to have been on the scene or have information from the firefighters or anything like that to tell you that if there's not a charger, then a charging car did not cause the fire. That's not to say that it's definite that an EV didn't cause a fire, but even last night when people were speculating like this, you could say with certainty that it wasn't a car that was charging that caused the fire. But that doesn't stop people. So even now we got this confirmation from the fire service that it was a diesel car that started the fire. And people are now saying, it can't possibly have been a diesel car. This is all a big cover-up, some people are even saying. It must be that people want to hide the fact that it was an EV, because everybody wants us to be driving EVs, so they are making up that it's a diesel car that's caused this fire. And it's unbelievable. And I think it shows really, really well the depths people go to put forward the narrative that they want to sort of have people believe, that the EVs are bad and they burst into flames and all this stuff. And I think without seeing some of these posts and seeing how this information disseminates so quickly, you don't actually fully appreciate quite how bad this stuff is getting. I've seen one person on Twitter saying, oh, that Evoque in that video, I want to see a registration number. I want to know exactly what model it is. And I want full analysis of what's going on and why the fire started. Because I just don't believe that a diesel car could cause a fire like this. So I'm saying, oh, diesel doesn't burn, so it can't be diesel that's caused the fire. And it's, again, people seem to have this conception that a tank full of diesel in the back of a car has burst into flames and caused a big fire, but that's not what anybody's saying has happened, right? It's very, very likely, especially if we're talking about a Land Rover product, that it suffered some kind of electrical fault that has then caused a fire, and then the heat from that fire heats the car up, burns everything around it, heats the fuel up, and then the fuel adds to the fire. That famous phrase, like adding fuel to the fire, yeah, okay. And the fire then spreads. And then, of course, from then on, there's so much heat, so much intensity of that fire that it takes out other vehicles with it. And then you have this domino effect, right? Where the fire just gets more and more and more intense because it's taking over more and more cars. And yeah, there may have also been hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles and EVs in this car park that then later got caught up in the fire, which made the fire worse and made the fire spread. But that's not to say that if there hadn't been, and if it had all been petrol and diesel cars that were in there, it would somehow have been really easy to put out, and that the firefighters would have had it out no problem, there'd hardly been any damage. Back in 2017, the Liverpool Echo Arena car park caught fire. And that was because a Range Rover with a questionable LPG conversion caught fire in this car park, and the fire then spread, and it took out loads of vehicles around it. 1,400 cars were lost in that fire, and the car park had to be demolished. Realistically, it's almost identical to what's happened at Luton Airport. But back then, EVs were such a tiny, tiny market share. SMMT back then were reporting that plug-in cars, so that's EVs and plug-in hybrids, were 1.9% of the market share. So statistically, there were hardly any going to have been in that car park in Liverpool that night. Even if there were a couple of percent of the cars that were there were such a tiny, tiny number that it was completely not contributing to the fire at all. Petrol and diesel cars alone, packed into a busy multi-storey car park, caused that car park to burn down and to be completely beyond repair to the point it had to be knocked down. So this is not a new problem. This is not a problem that electric vehicles have created. Cars are dangerous things, and if they catch fire, that fire will spread and that fire will be difficult to fight. This is not new. Yes, lithium batteries are horrible things if they catch fire. Lithium battery fires are terrible. They're toxic. They spread. they're really hot. But a load of petrol and diesel burning is not a pleasant thing. Petrol, diesel, plastics, oils, gearbox oils, a refrigerant for the air conditioning system, all that stuff together, burning is not something that you can just say, oh, you just put a bit of water on it, it'll be fine. It's a terrible, terrible thing. There are questions being asked about, were there sufficient fire suppressant systems in this car park? And that's not because you need to deal with EVs that are burning. It's because any kind of burning is difficult to put out, and some fire suppression might help with that, might make it quicker and easier to put the fire out. As of yet, those questions still are unanswered. This Terminal Car Park 2 at Luton Airport wasn't that old, so you'd expect it to comply with any relevant fire regulations, but I'm not sure for multi-storey car parks, especially ones that are open at the sides and at the top, how far that goes in terms of what fire suppression they need to have. And I'm sure this fire will lead to that being looked at and perhaps new regulations being introduced if it's deemed that actually, if it had been built in a slightly better way, it wouldn't have been as bad as it was. So it'll be really interesting to see how that pans out. What I think is quite interesting is among all of this misinformation, not everybody seems to be jumping on the bandwagon. So some of you will be aware of the YouTuber Geoff Buys Cars. Now, I can't say we agree on many things, and Geoff does a lot of talking about stuff that doesn't involve him buying cars, but he was actually communicating with his followers last night saying, stop speculating about this being an EV unless there is proof that it is. Until we see actual concrete proof that it is, stop saying that it is, because actually this is harmful. You can't be credible if you're just mouthing off saying, oh, it's definitely an EV, if it's clearly not. And I've got to respect him for that. Like I say, we don't agree on much, and we have very different audiences. I almost respect the hustle. I mean, he's got 10 times the subscribers that I have, so he must be doing something right. Clearly knows his market, knows how to engage them, so fair play. But for him to actually try to rein his followers in a little bit and say, look, you need to stop speculating about this, I respect that. He did publish a very clickbait heavy video today, but the message obviously is quite clear that actually all of this speculation about, oh, it must be an EV, is harmful to EVs, EV adoption, EV sales and the EV market, because actually if any car catching fire means that a lot of the general public are saying, oh, it must be an EV, then that's not going to help get people into EVs. So I do actually agree with the messaging and the thinking there. It's going to be a rare thing that you're going to hear me say that we agree on anything, but you've got to respect not wanting to fan the flames, if you excuse the terrible, terrible pun, and actually wanting to see some facts before going off on the deep end. That is it from this video. I wanted to highlight what exactly is going on and point out some of the misinformation and sort of say, well, don't believe everything you see on the internet is probably the message. It might seem strange from a content creator that puts out information in the form of these videos and I post on Twitter and all that stuff, but don't believe everything you see on the internet. It has to be the overriding message. Just the other day, there was a TikTok going around apparently showing an electric bus on fire in London. And, being spread around with the message, oh, look, it's in the clean air zone, or ULEZ, and yeah, it's an electric bus and it's on fire. How can that possibly be good for the environment? Well, turned out it was actually a diesel bus in Bradford, and it had been subject to an arson attack. So it wasn't even like a mechanical failure or anything like that. It was straight up arson. Someone had set this bus on fire, this diesel bus, and yet it was being presented to people as this electric bus has caught fire, they're terrible, they're awful. Don't believe everything you see on the internet. But that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments as always. I'll see you next time.